Time now for today's perspective. We are in danger of entering a post-antibiotic apocalypse. If the world fails to act, that certain bacteria could kill up to 10 million people a year by 2050. That's a warning from a Dutch environmental organisation that has researched the growth of drug-resistant bugs and looks at the cause behind them. Overconsumption of antibiotics, a well-known culprit, but something often overlooked is environmental pollution. To tell us more about that, we're joined by campaign manager for that foundation, Changing Markets, Natasha Hurley. Ms. Hurley, a very warm welcome to the show. Can I start by asking you, on your website, you say that these antimicrobial resistance, these superbugs, could kill up to 10 million of us a year. That's more than cancer or diabetes combined. Where does that figure come from?
So that figure comes from an independent review that was conducted by a body called the AMR Review, the Antimicrobial Resistance Review here in the UK. And that was a body commissioned by the UK government at the time to look into the global impacts of antimicrobial resistance, what it would mean in terms of death rates and also impact the economy. And that's the figure they came up with.
So very frightening figures, one wonders, is it not that we're already looking at solutions, creating new medicines? Why are we seeing such high figures and looking like a rise in those numbers?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, there are multiple factors in the development of drug-resistant bacteria. Obviously, consumption is one of them. We're consuming too many antibiotics, both in human medicine, in livestock rearing. The rates are skyrocketing, basically. But another factor that we particularly looked into was the impact of manufacturing pollution at factories in Asia, where most of our antibiotics are manufactured currently. India and China are the two main countries where our antibiotics are being made. And the problem is that environmental regulation is very lax or poorly implemented in those countries. And factories are simply dumping mistreated or poorly treated waste in the environment. And the presence of those antibiotic residues is leading to the development of drug resistance in bacteria in the environment. That drug resistance is then passed on to other bacteria. And when it passes on to human pathogens, that's a really deadly mix.
Indeed.
So what we're looking at is, the pharmaceutical
Sorry, Ms. Hurley, but yeah, we're seeing these international companies, because they are international, they're not Chinese or Indian companies really that are going out and setting up there. I mean, did these multinational pharmaceutical companies specifically go there because the environmental standards were less? I mean, is there a will to make sure that their production is clean?
Right, so pharmaceutical supply chains are extremely complex and opaque. And you're right, in many cases what we're seeing is that big multinational companies, big brand names that we know in the West, are outsourcing production to countries where maybe environmental standards are lower and labour costs are cheaper, and you also have access to a skilled workforce, obviously. So that's one big concern that we have, because pharmaceutical supply chains are so opaque. It's very difficult to establish quite what those trade flows are currently with a very great deal of precision. But what we do know is that big companies that we know in the West are outsourcing to these companies. We also know that there are lots of homegrown companies in India that are now exporting directly to the European market, for example. And we know that those companies, some of them have very poor environmental performance.
Now, Ms. Hurley, give me an idea, because indeed the effect of, putting antibiotics into our water streams trickles down to all of us, no matter where we are in the world. But what are the villages, surrounding these factories? Are we seeing, direct effects already in those areas?
Yeah, so we actually went on the ground and did an investigation, or several investigations, in Hyderabad in southern India. And what we saw was that as a result of industrial effluent from these factories in and around Hyderabad, you have livelihoods that have been ruined, subsistence livelihoods such as agriculture, but also fisheries are being impacted. So in recent years, you've seen massive what they call fish die-offs in lakes and rivers in Hyderabad, and that's really having a huge impact on people locally, obviously. because they're just having their sort of living and livelihoods ruined by the industrial practices that we're seeing.
Now, of course, we could claim perhaps ignorance in the past of the possible effects of our actions, but with those massive fish kills, hard to deny it now. Are things changing?
Things are changing. I mean, in the time that we've been working on this issue, the pharmaceutical industry has accepted that this is a problem. And certainly when we started working on this issue back in 2015, the pharmaceutical industry was in a state of denial. What we've seen in the meantime is an acceptance that the pharmaceutical industry, its irresponsible practices in many cases are contributing to the spread of antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So that's good that we're seeing that recognition. What we're lacking now is a regulatory framework that is really going to level the playing field for all players in the industry. And that's what we're partly calling for, is a change to the way inspections are carried out from Europe, for example. We need environmental criteria to be considered when we're purchasing drugs from India and China. So that's a really important factor for us. It's not just about voluntary initiatives, we need regulation.
Finally, Ms. Hurley, so greater awareness, greater education will help, but at the same time, I mean, what kind of danger do we face? Won't we just produce new antibiotics that can kill these superbugs?
The problem is that we have a broken model currently, so the problem won't be solved by coming up with new drugs. As long as we don't fix this broken model where we're producing in a polluting manner, we're over-consuming massively. As I said, agriculture currently represents about 3/4 of our use of antibiotics worldwide. So this is clearly a problem of consumption, massive consumption. And as long as we don't fix that, we'll be running a race against time every time we bring out a new antibiotic. So really we need to fix that broken model currently, and the industry needs to take responsibility for its impacts.
It sounds like a vicious and a dangerous cycle. Thanks so much for that insight into it, Miss Natasha Hurley from the Changing Markets Foundation.